Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining today's event, How to Save Your Business from a $2 million IoT Disaster. Before we get started, I'd like to go over some very quick housekeeping notes. First, I recommend that you turn off any other programs that could potentially take bandwidth, such as Outlook or Instant Messenger. Second, we encourage and enjoy interaction, so please go ahead and submit any questions you might have through the chat or Q&A boxes on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll make sure to address those for you. Lastly, today's session is being recorded, and we'll share a link to the recording to all of those who registered. So with that being said, let's get started. I'm Vanessa Welly, Marketing Director here at Logical Operations, and I'll be your host today. I'm joined by Megan Branch, Chief Operating Officer and Product Engagement Officer at CertNexus, and Pete Vorenkamp, CertNexus Emerging Technology Consultant, Contributor, and Instructor. They've got an exciting agenda planned for you today, so without further ado, I'll pass it over to Megan to get us started.
Thanks, Vanessa, and welcome to everybody who is joining us live and in the recording today. I also want to wish everybody a happy IoT Day. Many of you know that today is this event is part of IoT.org's International Agenda for IoT Day, and we're very proud to be a part of that. So without further ado, Vanessa introduced my title, a little bit of background, and not to dive in too deep, but I am privileged to be the COO and Product Engagement Officer for CertNexus. We develop high-stakes certifications in emerging technology, and my prior experience spans from customized training solutions for CRM, all the way up to managing large franchised training organizations for IT preparation for certifications. And I'm very excited that Pete Vorenkamp was able to clear his schedule today and be our special guest on today's session. So Pete, you want to take a minute and introduce yourself to everybody?
Yeah, thanks, Megan. So hi, everyone. My name is Pete Vorenkamp. So I am part of a lot of field experience for emerging tech, and CertNexus had asked me to come in and help validate their CIOTP practitioner certification course for IoT. So I have a multidisciplinary background, all in technology, with companies like HP and Rackspace and others. More recently, doing a lot of consulting with IoT startups and things like that. And so a lot of field experience and project management experience, and so I'm happy to help contribute and look forward to it.
Thanks, Pete. So we're going to get started with just a small number here, and many of you are probably familiar with this number of 20 billion. It's hard to grasp what that number means, but as we look at the Gartner Insights from a couple years ago, they predicted 20 billion Internet of Connected Things by next year. So just some fun stats to give some context to that. You know, if you were to live for 20 billion minutes, well, you'd be a pretty old 38,000 year old, well, plus that extra 52 years. Or if you want to put it into monetary figures, if you could save $10,000 a day, it would only take you a little over 5,000 years to save $20 billion. So, you know, Oprah's very familiar with that, but those of us living in the everyday world, you know, and Pete, you brought up a great quote from Bain & Company about where the future numbers are with IoT in terms of spend. So I don't know what you're seeing in, you know, your experience as a consultant for us and for other organizations in terms of the spend, and where do you see that happening?
Yeah, I mean, the early money in IoT really has been in the industrial sector, the IIoT sector. But we all see it in the consumer space as well, with a lot of consumer products, Amazon Alexa and things like that. Those are all the consumer-based, you know, IoT-enabled devices. But one thing's for sure, the acceleration has begun. There was a lot of hype, just like there was for cloud many years ago. But now with IoT, we're starting to see more acceptance, adoption, and acceleration in that space. And these numbers reflect some pretty gaudy not just the sheer number of devices to be connected, but the sheer amount of money. We're seeing a lot of the major platform players, the Amazons, the Microsofts, GE, IBM, and others that are all in. They are all in, fully invested in these, ecosystems to support what they see as a major revenue play coming. The topic and issue really for us is the fact that with this thing accelerating like the projections are, is that we have challenges, right, from a talent perspective for with IoT technology and security associated with IoT. So you have a very fast moving industry, and we're going to have a talent shortage. So it's a big deal to try and meet the needs that are going to match these kind of gaudy numbers.
Yeah, and when we talk about fast moving, I think we owe it to ourselves, and I know that you get into this when you go out and talk about IoT, but why is this happening now? And I love this image that's up on the screen. The top image is of one of the original computers. Now, that computer took up about 1,800 square feet within a warehouse and weighed more than 25 tons. Now, it had some pretty impressive processing power, so it could execute about 5,000 instructions per second. But when you look at the grouping of this perfect storm of enabling technologies over on the left-hand side of the screen, miniaturization and connectivity, and you look at the bottom image of that iPhone 6, which many people would think is already outdated, that's coming in comparison at a whopping 4.55 ounces. And it processes about 25 billion instructions per second. So Pete, I know you talk about these technologies, and this just is, I love these images because it's a great illustration of all of those technologies coming together. The connectivity, the fact that, that ubiquitous computing, we do the majority of computing, within an arm's length. It's either on our wrist or in our hand. We're not going to a warehouse anymore. And I know, you referenced cloud, but the evolution of cloud-based processing and the advancement in that, we're talking about things like 5G these days, and just the availability and the relative, low cost of the parts that go into devices and even across the IoT infrastructure. So this creates the perfect storm in terms of why we are talking about these crazy, obscene numbers of 20 billion. And we titled this session about how to save that $2 million. And really it's looking at how do you succeed so you don't lose that $2 million. And if we look at some of the numbers that are coming out from the Cisco survey that came out at the end of last year, you're looking at 26% of companies, only 26% could call one of their initiatives in IoT a success. So how do we save, hundreds of thousands of dollars to start off with by just having a successful implementation? Many of these companies aren't even getting out of the pilot phase. And I know, Pete, you've worked with some of these companies and you've worked with some of the vendors of some of these companies that are challenged by, these projects and these statistics here.
Yeah, if we look at the next slide, I mean, we'll touch on these. There's a lot of factors, right, with why we're seeing, at least in the early out of the gate, so to speak, implementation failures. And the reason these are some obvious ones, and we'll touch on these, but there's more subtle ones as well. But why do they typically take too long? I mean, that's a big one. And it's because they don't understand, in many cases, when you implement a brand new technology like this, you don't start off with a full-scale implementation. That's a huge mistake. And so they get into it, they find out a couple of things. They don't have the right talent to put it all together. It is a system ecosystem that is really a system of systems. It's way more complicated than typical technology implementations. And so there's just a lot of unknowns when you dive into it. So yeah, it typically takes much longer than people think. And this is why it's so important to be very careful about, how you kind of approach these implementations. I touched on the fact that enterprises have limited expertise. You need a multidisciplinary team to pull this off. It is not just an IT project. It involves field technology or operational technology disciplines. It involves security and standard IT and networking and cloud expertise and a bunch of other things. So there are a lot of pieces, parts involved in here. The quality of the data, a lot of times data is collected where we're digitizing the physical world, and everybody just wants to kind of go out and just digitize a bunch of things. Well, that's a recipe for disaster, because what happens then is you're collecting too much data, you're not collecting and filtering the correct data, and a bunch of other things that are associated with it. When you want to do things like machine learning and AI and all of these other things that are associated with this, you really need to understand what you're doing. So that requires some level of data science expertise as well on the team. So just even understanding what you need, right? This integration across many different disciplines and teams, you need all of those things. It is not like a standard IT implementation. And I think that's the mistake. You'll have a lot of companies say, well, we have an IT department, but we got a network person, we got a storage person, we should be fine, right? We should be good to go. Let's just dive in. And that's typically what happens. And that's typically why we see such a low success rate.
Yeah, you and I have talked about this before, but my favorite comment when I go and am at conferences and talking with some of our customers is around cloud. And they're talking about, well, we're very familiar with cloud. We've implemented cloud technology. You referenced sort of the mistakes that were made when, cloud came out on the market. And that's just one piece of it. And I love the fact that you're referencing the idea that companies are they're jumping in as a full-scale implementation. One of the consultants that I spoke with was referencing a company that they were working with in the power sector, where OT, or I'm sorry, it was in the manufacturing sector, and where OT wanted to, they wanted to reduce some costs, and they were looking at it from an operational standpoint, those technicians, and they're saying, listen, we can implement this, and we can, we were already documenting preventative failure and we were predicting that, but let's put some IoT in there. And the mistake was they went correctly through the right processes, went to their IT department and said, this is something we want to integrate. And IT said, great, we'll review it and let you know in 4 months. Well, that was too long for them. And so they implemented it without the consensus and the integration between IT and OT, which we know traditionally those departments within organizations and across enterprises, typically are not known to work well together, or at least even have to work together. And this is really changing that landscape. So I know you talk significantly about not diving in right away. And one of the big things that you can do to successfully launch an implementation is defining those goals. And so what are some of the things that people can do to define those goals?
Yeah, so Bain and Company has a study out that kind of highlights this, but typically what happens is organizations, if they don't have a proper baseline understanding of IoT and of the various vendor platforms they're working with, they dive in and try and say, we're going to go with a full scale collection of data that we want to pull in. We want to get data on all these sensors. And so the first step is to just implement some large effort to collect data. And that's really step 3. That's not step 1. And so that's the mistake, right? Is to just go right after, what data do we need? Let's go collect data and we'll see if we can, somehow monetize that. That never works. I can tell you, it does not work. And what happens is you end up collecting a bunch of data. You didn't really tie it back to what incremental value you were trying to capture. And so that's the wrong path. The right path is to first start at a business level. What incremental or new value are you trying to capture? Most businesses, maybe you're just trying to reduce costs so that you can have more competitive pricing, right? That's an incremental value play. Maybe if you're lucky, maybe you have a completely new revenue stream of money that you can make off of your product or service that you could never do before. What's possible with IoT. Either way, that is your first effort to define and understand at a business level, right? What is this value you're trying to capture? Once you have that, then you can ask the question of, okay, what new information do we need to collect that will give us the insights to be able to facilitate that incremental or new value? That's your second step. Once you understand that piece of it, then you get to the step of, okay, what data would feed that new insight that we need to be able to provide that incremental value? That's the right order to do it properly. Businesses have kind of fumbled through it. They've started off at step 3, realized that was a mistake, and then kind of backed up and said, wait a minute, what are we trying to solve here at a business level? Because this is not going to be cheap. And so you really want to make sure that you're following the right logical steps through kind of your understanding. And companies that do it right, or even kind of recover from mistakes and then come back, they go through this process and realize, okay, yeah, it's not quite what we thought. Maybe we've got to take a different approach here. I'll give it just a very baseline example. One company just went straight to, putting a bunch of sensors out and collecting data. Well, what they found out is, first of all, they were collecting a bunch of data they didn't need and didn't really add any value to their business. The second thing they found out is that the data they were collecting was via cellular, and they were sending massive amounts of data over cellular. Well, guess what? That's expensive. And then they realized, man, we really were wasting a ton of money on the edge, the IoT edge, where the sensors are, and moving that data back to the cloud that we didn't need. So they had to completely back up and rethink the whole approach. And their final solution actually required very little data that they needed to extract from the actual sensors. They could process more at the edge and do things more responsive at the edge, which was another thing they found out they needed. But it just completely changed their solution.
Yeah, and I think there's plenty of cases, that we have heard of on just the opposite, where they're starting on that number 3 and they're looking at the data, and the data that they're looking to connect is actually too narrow. You look at, there's a great story out there about Pittsburgh, who implemented smart trash cans at $1,200 per can. Pretty significant investment when you're talking about a city or a municipality the size of Pittsburgh. And, there's not a full case study on that, but their data that they're trying to pull from that is pretty narrow. I mean, they're really just measuring, is the can full or not? When there are a lot of other factors, when you're looking to replace a human resource in that, that those humans measure, that potentially could be valuable information collected from that trash can. So, whether it's too broad, in your example, or too narrow, that step number 1. And I think from your project management background, how important is it for you, as from a project management standpoint, when you're handed over a project, to have number 1 clearly defined?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's in any good project manager, right? You're supposed to understand your stakeholders and have the project or program properly defined, right? So that is a key, is to really make sure you understand. And if you don't, you got to push back, right? I know easier said than done, but you got to make sure absolutely that you understand what you're trying to solve for. And then once you get those kinds of things lined up, then I think following the right approach, doing a proof of concept, and the Bain report kind of re-emphasizes this, is that some businesses kind of try to jump right into a pilot or worse, full scale, and realize, wait a minute, you didn't even really do a proof of concept. So from a project perspective, having the right team, the right talent assembled, right, understanding the objective correctly, and then going from proof of concept, then to pilot, then to scale is the right order to do this.
Yeah, and I would also say, from just a saving standpoint, from a financial standpoint, understanding that a lot of the projects that you're hearing about at conferences and out in some of the tech blogs are in fact proof of concept. So from a business standpoint, when you're evaluating, the potential opportunity there, making sure that you're testing it beyond just a concept. But I think that one of those things that might be helpful is actually diving into what some of the value opportunities are that you have seen. And we actually reordered these yesterday when we were running through this presentation and put that reduce operational costs, which you've referenced back at the top. Tell me why, and explain to our listeners why.
Yeah, so typically in most projects, it's very hard to, especially if you're doing incremental value kinds of things, it's usually harder to justify those type of initiatives and projects. The easier one to go after, many businesses go after, is reducing operational costs, right? We're all familiar, anybody should be at least familiar with those types of initiatives, whether we like them or not, right? They're usually some sort of cost reduction initiative, right? It's a little easier to tie an ROI to those, and so that's typically what you see. So my recommendation for a lot of businesses considering getting into IoT is, first look for those kinds of opportunities. They're easier to prove out, not necessarily easier to implement, but easier to show cost returns and things like that. And maybe they're focused around reducing, I don't know, if you're a manufacturing plant, a lot of times reducing natural resources is an easy one to go after, right? Or if you're in agri-tech, reducing water, consumption and feed consumption, even, and things like that, by being much more sophisticated in how we measure things like that. And then you move up, right? And the other bullets here, like improve competitive position, those are huge, right? That's really where IoT is going to get the biggest wins, I believe, is really in attacking a fact that you have a whole different way to present your product or service or new capability. I mean, we're even seeing, right, IoT enabled elevators. You wouldn't think that that would be something so significant, but it actually is. And so there are lots of opportunities to improve your competitive position for sure. As far as new and enhanced revenue streams, this is I guess, the absolute gold standard, where businesses that before just had, let's say, a product sale, but that's it. There was no additional revenue streams associated with it. Well, guess what? With IoT, in many cases, there is entirely new revenue streams. Now you might have some tracking logistics service associated with your product or service, or who knows what, but you can start to enhance and add new revenue streams. As long as you can identify those and get ROI measured on those are the big wins. That's what really everybody is shooting for. Once again, in manufacturing, in the industrial IoT space, that's where we're seeing a lot of that as well. Even the modern farm equipment is riddled with IoT-enabled sensors, and they're able to do all kinds of additional things with the products and services that they're offering. And by the way, this enhanced revenue stream goes all the way back from front end retail to supply chain to manufacturing vendors, all the way up the up and down the value stream, right?
Yeah, and we haven't even touched on healthcare. I mean, the IoT devices and capabilities within healthcare are immense and already, being used significantly for all of these bullets right here.
Yep. And then things like predictive capability. This is another easy one. Maybe it ranks right in there with operational cost, but the ability to use IoT to kind of predict ahead of time for things like mean time between failure and other metrics like that are critically important for most businesses that have products and or services. You look at companies like GE and others, where their entire business model is you no longer own the jet engine, you just own the results that the jet engine produces. And that's a completely, flipped on its head model, right? In the future, we're all going to be mostly using equipment and things as a utility, not owning the equipment. And that's much, much bigger. We already see in the industrial space.
Absolutely. I mean, we've seen companies like Rolls-Royce, grow exponentially using those models. So when we get into more of some of those points of failure and addressing those in terms of cost savings, you certainly touched on the fact of establishing your team. I think a lot of this is really doing the due diligence to identify your team, no matter what the size, and identify where those gaps are and seeing if you can fill those gaps internally by, training, Pete, you're very familiar with 2 out of the 3 of the programs that we have here are IoT Pro, which is really intended for the leaders, the salespeople, the marketing people to level set their base knowledge and really understand how to design and initiate some strategic goals that we've talked about here today. And then really having a team that can implement successfully with the practitioner and then securing it. We haven't even talked about security, but that's where the real savings comes in terms of identifying that everything we've talked about to this point, depending upon your implementation, we're talking in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. But when we talk about securing, a project and making sure that you're building it and not overspending, is important when we talk about making sure that you have practitioners and security practitioners in place, for this implementation. And then, of course, I know you put in, Pete, you did reference something in terms of expertise and resources that are out there. This is one of my favorite images. We always think of, the wagon wheel to the bicycle and, just the idea that use those existing reference architectures. And you have some good ones that you utilize right now, correct?
Yeah, and I just posted on the comment section the one reference website that talks about a lot of alliances and organizations associated with it. Because this is kind of a new space for a lot of teams, you don't have to start from scratch. There are existing organizations that are well advanced in reference architectures around IoT. Some of the more popular ones are listed in there. IEEE, of course, is always working on it. IOTA is another big one. So there are many organizations out there that have a lot of good reference, as well as the vendors themselves, right? So the big cloud players that are building platforms around it, Amazon and Microsoft and IBM and GE, Predix and things like that. There are a lot of big players that have a lot of existing information out there, as well as some of the open source organizations as well. So to get in on the technical side to better understand these architectures, there's a lot of useful information out there.
Yeah, and then I would be remiss in saying that, you want to make sure that you're validating your team's knowledge of, the awareness of these and the importance of them by, using things like certifications to validate that knowledge and skills that they have, to make sure that you're consistently, monitoring that customer experience. Because, one of the biggest losses in revenue that you can see is, losing your customer trust. And when you're dealing with such immense amounts of data that IoT provides, if you breach that trust within your customer, that could be a devastating loss for a small to mid-size or even a larger company when we talk about the data. We're a couple minutes out, but some other things that we want to touch on in terms of, broader stream and broader savings is there is legislation and regulation coming down the pipe. Pete, you've been in technology, and I have certainly been in the compliance and regulatory areas throughout our careers. The newest federal legislation that people are talking about really is just starting to establish those standards, whereas industry and companies like CertNexus are, taking the leap and setting those standards by putting a stake in the ground and establishing frameworks and references and certifications around IoT. So the interesting piece in this legislation that I'm intrigued with, and maybe is a subject for another webinar, is they're still looking to define what IoT is. You look at the California legislation that is defined where security should live, and that's another huge expense that can cost you millions, in the millions, in terms of security breaches. Because as I said, that data around coming off of IoT devices can be so rich, but also offers a significant amount of risk. And that's really where that, as we kind of close out and get to that $2 million mark, this is within the customer trust and making sure that you're compliant and you have the opportunity to grow within the government sector with those regulations, and also, mitigating any security breach. That is where some of the significant savings comes in the long term. And I don't know what you've seen. We all have heard some of the stories around breaches, and to tie back to that case study that I referenced early on from the the IoT consultant that was working in industry, what happened when OT implemented their solution, actually they tied into the network, and because IT was not consulted on it, they had a significant business interruption in their manufacturing floor. So that's another significant loss that you can talk about as well. And I know, Pete, you've seen that as a fallout when people call you on the bat phone and say, all right, what do we do now?
Yeah, and it's typically that they don't have the right expertise in their team when they're implementing, right? This whole idea of a interdisciplinary approach to IoT is critical. And if you don't have it, those kinds of things will certainly be more than likely will happen.
Yeah, and making sure that it is consistent across an organization certainly helps. So, what everyone is seeing up here on the screen are, some next steps. That IoT Pro is sort of our, pared down version and base level knowledge for professionals, particularly solution architects and salespeople, marketing people, business leaders that are trying to understand what their IoT strategy is. If anyone's interested, Pete is an amazing, and he's going to lead the sessions that you see up there. And then for your IT team, diving in deep, the people that are building the implementation of practitioner, and then our security practitioner, which is actually very new. We're just getting out of our beta period for that right now. So there's lots of information so that when you approach your IoT projects, your ability to design it and to build it and secure it can save you more than $2 million in a loss, and hopefully, boost up that 24% of successful IoT implementations. Pete, any last words of advice? And I haven't seen any questions come through in the chat, but I want to be respectful of people's time. We will stay on the line and answer questions as long as we see them coming in. You can use the chat session or the Q&A section within the WebEx.
No, I guess just a wrap for me is just to reinforce the fact that IoT is unlike other technologies that we've seen in the industry. It really does require that multidisciplinary approach and following kind of the right order of understanding your value, then the insights, and then what data to support it. Building the right team, getting a clear definition of what you're trying to do. It has just tremendous opportunity. There's no question about it, but it does require a little bit more of a cautious approach and proper baseline training before you dive in.
Absolutely, and we actually do have one question. What have we seen in the lack of data mapping between the edge and core enterprise systems? You referenced that in one of the case studies you've seen before, Pete. Have you seen the lack of data mapping?
Yeah, so a lot of times the focus is all on the edge and making sure that you're collecting various sensor data and maybe processing this decision of how much information is processed at the edge. Some needs to be fed to the back end cloud, right, for bigger processing, if you will. But maybe I think where this question is going is that the core enterprise systems, right, your back end systems, there's a huge lack of connection to that. To me, that's where the real value is. It's not collecting the data. To me, that's part of it, but that's just part of the plumbing. The key is how is that data being fed back into your core enterprise systems so that business decisions are being extracted and insight, is being obtained on the back end. This is once again, right? You've got to have your back end business, your BPAs and your other business process people in that team too. And that typically is not the group that you would think would be maybe part of an implementation, IoT implementation, but absolutely they are critical, because without that piece of it, without that part of the integration, you've kind of missed the bigger point of obtaining this collection of insights.
Right, and I love your analogy to the plumbing. If you come in and you have just one team, build out the infrastructure without understanding the why or having the people monitoring, what you're pulling out of that system. It goes back to those three key points you were talking about, is defining that value and in the data.
Yeah.
Robert,
Yeah.
I hope that answered your question.
Well, he had a follow on talking about unmanaged complexity. I totally agree. This is, like I said, where IoT tricks a lot of people, in that there is a lot of complexity to these implementations. And I do think fairly that's why a lot of implementations struggle as well. So that there's no question that yeah, I think people underestimate, right? They just think, well, it's just an IT project. We've done 100 IT projects. It's just another IT project. It's not the case. It's not the case.
Yeah, and I think that people get, obviously you can see the big players that you've referenced before, the technology is always looked at as the solution when it's just one piece of the puzzle. So I think Robert's probably going to want to connect with you offline, Pete. And any other questions, comments? Follow-ups? How you're going to celebrate IoT Day? All right, I think we'll wrap it up here. I'm going to put up my contact information. If you want to connect with Pete directly, you can reach him through me. And thank you everybody for attending, whether you attended live or recorded. We appreciate your time, and we look forward to hearing your success stories within IoT.
All right. Thanks, everyone.